Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of World History. I am Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at imperialism in Africa, with our overall goal being to understand how Europeans divide up this continent amongst themselves during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So let's dive into West Africa. Now, by the late 1800s, the slave trade had been outlawed. This is where Europeans had first really gotten involved in the colonization of Africa, was West Africa, and it was the slave trade. But by the late 1800s, we've moved beyond that into different areas. But Europeans do still remain very interested in West African goods. And merchants had maintained relations in that region, no longer trading in human beings, but definitely trading in the goods of the region. Now, in 1874, it is going to be the British that become the first to annex territory in this region. They will annex this guy right here, the Gold Coast, and it will become an official colony of the British Empire rather than just a location that they were doing trade. This new Gold Coast colony would be profitable for the British. Now, soon others, especially the French, were annexing territory of their own. And West Africa really does largely become, at least territorially, controlled by the French. They have very large territorial claims throughout the region. Now, keep in mind, the inland area is more difficult to control, less populated, especially when you get up into the Sahara Desert. But the French really come to dominate this region. All right, Egypt. Egypt is kind of its own little story because Egypt wins its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1805. So it is not going to come under European domination right away, although their independence is tied into Napoleonic Wars. So we are talking about this time. And there certainly is going to be some French influence that inspires this revolution. But Egypt does get its independence. They are an independent nation in 1805. Now, by 1869, Egypt has completed the Suez Canal, a canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea to this little finger of the Red Sea, which gives access out to the Indian Ocean, making it much easier for Europeans to trade with India rather than having to go around the entire continent of Africa. Now, the British are going to see this canal as being really important. India has become the most important British colony. It's a source of a lot of their wealth. And if they can get to and from India much more easily, they want to control that. And so they buy the rights to the Suez Canal. But there are people in Egypt who don't like the idea of foreign control of this valuable national asset. And so they start to rebel against the government, a government that is allowing the British to do this. The British come in to help put down those rebellions, and this series of rebellions wind up increasing British control over the region as a whole. And it ultimately ends up with the Egyptian government being kind of a puppet state of the British Empire. Right, North Africa. North Africa, apart from Egypt, had seen European control of port cities since the early 1800s. Europeans had been involved, but largely, again, focused mostly on trade and trade routes and just controlling port cities. But in 1830, the French in particular are going to be establishing broader coastal colonies. And they're going to focus here first on Algeria, or French Algiers. And they're going to expand then inland as the race to capture Africa gets into full swing around 1880. So 1879, you start to see the French really pushing inland in a mad rush. Now, by 1912, France is also going to be pushing outward control and controlling the neighbors of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco as well. Now, Italy is going to try and fail to colonize Ethiopia. It winds up being this huge national embarrassment that they failed at their first attempt at colonization. This is a image down here of the battle in which the Ethiopian army defeats the Italian army. But they will try again, and they will capture the North African colony of Tripoli from the Ottoman Empire in 1911, and they're going to rename that Libya, which is the modern name of that country. All right, Central Africa. The British were the first Europeans to show serious interest in Central Africa, but ultimately declined to colonize it, did not see Central Africa as being worth the effort. But using the information acquired largely by the British, the Belgian government is going to step in, take that information, know that the British aren't interested, and seize that opportunity for themselves. And in 1876, Belgium is going to establish the largest colony in this area, the Belgian Congo. Now, this large Belgian claim will spur others to make claims of their own. The French get involved in Central Africa as well. But again, the British don't seem interested. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Belgian Congo because this winds up being one of the most stark examples of the brutality of European colonialism, because the Belgians were absolutely savage. You see this image right here. This is a man who was forced to work in a rubber plantation in the Belgian Congo. But because he did not meet his quota on rubber, the officials came into his village, found his 5-year-old daughter, and cut off her hand and foot, and then delivered that to him as a message to not miss his quota again. This is the type of brutality that, in particularly, the Belgian Congo was facing, but to a lesser extent, was being forced on many of the African people by these European colonizers. All right, East Africa. East Africa was one of the last places to really be colonized by Europeans. And it is going to be Germany that starts taking a lead in this, because they had entered this race for imperialism a little bit late. They hadn't been interested at first, but the German people started to see other nations building big overseas empires and demanded that their government step up and do the same. So the Germans eventually decided to do it, even though they didn't really see the value. In 1884, the Germans then host this conference called the Berlin Conference. They invite all the major European powers who are interested in East Africa in particular to sit down, meet, and decide how they were going to carve up that territory. And in the end, when it comes to East Africa, Germany got a huge chunk. The British got a huge chunk. The Italians had already had this from their failed efforts to take over Ethiopia. And Portugal winds up getting a little bit of land as well between German East Africa and South Africa. All right, the Boer Republics. Here we're going to be talking about South Africa. South Africa was actually one of the first to be thickly colonized. The climate was much more similar to European climate. Europeans took to this land very well. It's very wealthy with resources. And the Dutch get in there and they say, hey, let's do this. Let's make a colony. But the British eventually take that colony from them. This was during the Napoleonic Wars. At one point, the Dutch had backed the French. The British came down, took their colony because they were enemies at that time. And the British renamed this colony the Cape Colony. Now, disgruntled Boers, that's what they were called. The Dutch colonists called themselves the Boers, or sometimes the Afrikaners. But the Boers move inland once they're pushed off the Cape, and they create these 3 other Boer Republics. These new Boer Republics, however, are going to run up against an enemy kind of their own making. The Boer Republics were hyper racist, far much more so than, say, the British were. And they were forcing all the African people who had lived there into these enclaves, into these small territories. We can see 2 of them here, Swaziland and Besotoland. But once you have concentration of people who really don't like you, things tend to explode. And out of these enclaves, we get the Zulu Empire, which at one point does kind of take over one of the Boer Republics. This Zulu Empire, under a leader, brilliant man by the name of Shaka Zulu, winds up carving out this empire to combat Boer aggression. And the Zulus are successful. They push the Boers back. The Boers are not doing well in these wars. And the Zulus are kind of threatening to overrun the rest of the Boer Republics and really take charge there and create a solid African nation up until the British decide that that's not in their interests. The British join the Boers and defeat the Zulu Empire. But there's a side effect of this. See, during these Zulu Wars and after the Zulu Wars, as the British are in the Boer Republics, they discover, oh my gosh, there's a lot of gold and diamonds up here. It would be awfully nice to have these. The discovery of these resources will eventually lead to the Boer War. There's kind of a scheme that's hatched up to try to make it seem like the Boer Republics are rebelling against their own leadership. It fails. It triggers the Boer Wars. The British will win these wars, and they're going to annex Boer lands into the Union of South Africa. But the British are super brutal to the Boer population, and I mean like concentration camps with hundreds of thousands of people in them. Estimates of about 30,000 people die in those concentration camps. Here are some of the Afrikaners, the Boers, the Dutch settlers at the British treatment during these Boer Wars. So these concentration camps were nasty, nasty things. Now, the Boers were really kind of upset about what the British had done. So to appease them, they kind of adopt some of the Boer racist policies in that territory. So the South African Union, as it comes to be known, winds up being more racist than the British typically are in their colonial possessions. All right, colonial rule in South Africa. By 1914, only Ethiopia, or Abyssinia here, and Liberia had remained independent. In Africa, the British preferred indirect rule, largely allowing local elites to rule so long as they followed British directions. So we tell you what to do, you tell your people that that's what you're doing, we're good, you can stay in power. Other nations tended to prefer direct rule. This is especially true with the French. The French really tried to put their own people in place, eradicate local culture and customs, make the place more French. And so to this day in West Africa, you'll see that a lot of those nations speak French as their primary language. This is a broader image of the area. Just so you can see, French and English really have taken the largest chunks. Germany's got a decent chunk as well. Portuguese kind of come in a distant fourth. All right, African nationalism. So as we saw in Southeast Asia, the first generation does not do a good job of resisting this, but the next generation is going to do better. It's because they're going to be educated in Western ways, come up with Western thought, and use this thought kind of against their colonial oppressors. They are ambitious. They want new jobs. They want new opportunities that their colonizers had been denying them, or the puppet governments had been denying them. And so they are going to grow into a national movement. They embrace Western ideas, and we'll see this in Africa to this day, but they also want a nation of their own. And in time, Africa will build those nations, but that is going to come a fair while after World War II. So we're not going to see the real rise of African nationalism until the 1950s, 60s. All right, that is all that we have for today. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.